One Punch Man is a ridiculous series that parodies just about every shonen trope out there. A funny show, but not one to be taken at all seriously. I disagree. I think there's some really interesting ideas to talk about, especially if you have the forbidden word, a J-O-B. But it's also just an awful feeling to lose that fire for something you used to love, or just in general. So let's jump right into episode 1, with the very opening scene being the extremely mundane and ordinary commute. The feeling we all know and dread of going to work, interrupted by Budget Piccolo. These absurd hero names like Lightning Max, Smile Man, and of course a bored, directionless, unemployed man with the strength of a god, who calls himself a hero for fun, yet has no fun being a hero because everything is far too easy for him. Something that a lot of us obviously can't relate to, but I'll come back to that. We jump straight into Saitama's past, and again there's this contrast between this ridiculous crab wearing underwear with nipples drawn on and Saitama's mundane, relatable search for a job. And it's no coincidence that work keeps coming up in these early episodes, or that the very first thing this crab says is, "You must be a salaryman, bored with company life. I guess you want to die." Saitama is completely apathetic, not even caring to run from the monster in front of him or to warn the kid he knew it was targeting, until something just snaps. He remembered his silly childhood dream of being a hero who could send shameless villains like you flying with one punch. 3 years later, he got exactly what he wanted and felt less satisfied than ever, bored out of his mind by how easily he wins every single fight he's in. His would-be hobby now brings him no joy, which I guess is kind of the equivalent of playing a video game on a difficulty way too easy for you. It just gets boring pretty quickly. But I also think there's a larger discussion to be had here, in that maybe the excess of convenience that we have makes us kind of bored as well. And I promise this isn't going to be some Sigma grind set thing, just hear me out here. You ever look at everything you could watch on Netflix, or all your games on Steam, and think, I have literally no interest in any of this? Or scroll on your phone for hours but don't feel remotely interested in it? Obviously I'm aware I'm speaking to people from all over the world right now, but for a lot of us, we can sit around and not do anything besides a few household chores for the entire weekend if we wanted. And sometimes that's nice obviously, but much like Saitama winning all of his fights with just one punch, after a while it can get kind of dull, but we keep doing it anyway because it's easy and comfortable, even though we'd enjoy doing something else way more if we push past that initial resistance. And yet, Saitama doesn't really go out of his way to do anything else. You know, he watches TV, goes out grocery shopping, hits a monster on the way there, then he comes back and watches TV over and over and over again. He had way more excitement, way more fun back when the fights were hard for him. And we see how incredibly fired up all the heroes around him are basically all the time. Yet, Saitama never seems to have thought about seeking out a different challenge now that he's bored out of his mind. Something that isn't fighting, something that would actually stimulate him. And I know it's just an OVA, but regardless, when he has this rock, paper, scissors reaction time thing against Bang, we see him fired up again at an actual challenge. But I think the point I'm making here is pretty clear, and obvious points aside about being careful what you wish for and enjoying the journey more than the destination, which we see in this man who becomes a giant, becoming the strongest man like he wanted, but after accidentally killing his brother, having nothing left. Now what do I do? You know, I feel like this is a great example that we can all look at and understand like straight away. You know, what good is being the strongest when you're 500 meters tall, can never interact with anyone again, and all you'll ever do is crush cities? Seeing this giant towering figure made it all too clear to me that getting what you want without caring about how you get there is sometimes a terrible, terrible thing. There's a much broader question here in terms of what's actually worth sacrificing to reach a goal, you know, which I've spoken about in some of my Haikyuu videos, you know, about not sacrificing health, time with family, etc. Because as Saitama says, in exchange for power, have I lost something even more important? And something I feel like I see a lot online these days mirrors what Saitama's gone through. He chased after this to distract himself from feeling so miserable without ever asking himself what he was actually distracting himself from, what the root cause of that misery was. I'm talking about before he decided to become a hero here, where he thought just achieving a certain thing would solve all of his problems and is shocked when it doesn't. I've been there. It's not the end result which solves anything, or not a lot anyway. It truly is the process of working towards something that gets you fired up and you're excited to do that is the real blessing. So don't sacrifice anything stupid to get there, and don't fixate on, oh well, I'm not there yet, I want to be like that, because that as well also really takes away from the enjoyment of it. One thing I do want to correct Saitama on though is when he says monsters are still around, so I've had no impact on society. Maybe not as far as he can tell, but in chapter 15 we find out that the hero organization was found by the grandfather of the boy he saved 3 years ago from Crablante. He doesn't even realize it, but he's had a massive impact on the world and saved who knows how many lives indirectly from that. Anyway, to finish episode 1 off, I love how the series has so much fun with the whole one punch thing in these early episodes. By the time we're 3 or 4 episodes in, we know Saitama's just gonna win every time with one punch, right? But I distinctly remember the first time I watched this, and there's that ever so slight delay after he hits the mole man that makes you wonder, oh, is it actually gonna survive that? Of course it doesn't, and we get an incredibly cool fight that's just an absolute blast to watch, but that's it for episode 1. Now, episode 2 of the Mosquito Lady. So here's a funny story for you. So season 1 came out in 2016, I believe, so it would have been 16-ish at the time. I was just getting into anime, had only seen a few by this point, and thought nothing of just watching episode 1 on the TV, right? And my parents in their, 50s at the time came in and sat down and watched episode 1 with me, and were like, what the fuck was that? Can we put something else on, right? And at the time I remember being slightly annoyed, but I can only imagine their reaction had I watched the next episode with this questionable mosquito lady thing talking about empty your juices into me. I'm so glad that didn't happen. But that aside, this is where we get one of the coolest characters, and one who, without, the series just wouldn't really work. Genos. With intense seriousness and a purpose for getting stronger that he's willing to give his own life for, he contrasts Saitama perfectly. And something that I really took on board from him, even when I was 16 watching this for the first time, is that Genos asking Saitama to teach me how to become strong like you is a pretty silly question. In part because we'd already heard Saitama got this strong by training so hard his hair fell out. And as Saitama later tells him, that's something that just isn't really relevant for Genos. Being a cyborg, what works for Saitama isn't going to work for him. But also he's obsessed with looking for this shortcut, the secret to Saitama's strength, this switch he can flick to suddenly get stronger, instead of working up towards it. Which you see a lot these days, right? It obviously gets people's attention. They want kind of the quickest way, there's a lot of fitness influencers claiming, oh, do this one exercise, it'll double your shoulder gains, right? Shortcuts like that just don't really exist in basically anything, and you're probably just wasting your time going after them. Anyway, as Saitama later tells him, training his body won't do anything. All he can train is his mind, and that's gonna take time. And just before we get to Saitama's legendary speech on how he did it, is something that the story is actually quite cruel with at times, Characters like Moomin Rider never really seem to get much stronger, no matter how much they train. He'd never be able to match up to someone like Tank Top Master, for example, but more on that later. Much like Genos, Genus expects Saitama's secret to be some sort of shortcut, surgery, genetic manipulation, a secret drug, but instead, it's just a training program. 100 push-ups, 100 sit-ups, 100 squats, and a 10-kilometer run every single day. And obviously this is pretty flawed, right? No progressive overload, not hitting his back, etc. Obviously this is just an anime, but again, the point really stuck with me. Rather than trying to find this perfect secret optimal plan, just doing something hard, consistently, even if it's flawed, is gonna end up way better. And obviously, this links into the author's struggles as well. He was scolded by his parents for trying to become a manga artist, and turned down by Shonen Jump because of his drawings were just really not the best. But he got better and better at it. And I'm not an artist myself, but it's pretty easy to see that there's no shortcuts to that. It's just gradual, steady improvement. As Saitama says nicely in that beautiful line, human strength lies in the ability to change yourself. And honestly, it really is so cool how much we can improve at literally anything if we stick with it long enough. I've always thought this is just genuinely so cool that humans can just practice something and get so much better at it. But unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, some parts of the story slightly go against the sentiment put forward here. I mentioned Moomin Rider, but there's also things like Suryu, who I've probably not pronounced that right, but he was just insurmountable for everyone who went up against him, despite not even training a lot of the time. It's not that this is completely unrealistic, of course. These kind of crazy genetic outliers do exist. Some of you might know that I picked up volleyball about a year and a half ago, and my coach mentioned to me that when he was younger, there was someone at his school who was like 6'11" by the time they're, 15, 16, right? And within a year of picking up the sport, they were getting offers from national clubs, right? So these kind of crazy outliers do exist. It's frustrating, but it is what it is. And this is something Season 2 focuses on a lot more. That frustration at a seemingly unbreakable barrier. So I'll speak more about it in that video, but you might want to check out my Rock Lee video if that interests you. I think you'll be kind of surprised by what I say in it. But going back to One Punch Man for now, the writer clearly knew this was his last chance to make us question if Saitama could actually win before, we just wise up to it and know he was just messing with us again. So obviously he has Saitama just beat up and sounding like he's lost somehow until he throws a punch back and ends it in a single hit. But to be honest, he got me the first time I watched this. I can't lie. I remember wondering what secret weakness Saitama had that was about to be exploited. I really do feel like the author spent a lot of time thinking about how to write this gimmick in order to keep it really interesting. So moving ahead, episode 4, and I mentioned Hammerhead right at the start, and work, etc. And we kick off with him questioning, why can't we share food around? Why are the rich allowed so much whilst there are people starving to death out there? Why are we slaves to labour working such long weeks in exchange for so little? None of which are actually unreasonable questions, right? Besides the fact that, we live in a world where we can produce far more than we could ever use and yet still work just as much as we used to and actually have less than we would have a few decades ago. But besides that, going back to the episode, this is also where we meet Moomin Rider and Speed of Sound Sonic, but I don't really want to talk about either of them yet. We will later, but the only two things I want to talk about in this episode are what Saitama says when he encounters Hammerhead. After seeing his spinning arm attack, claims, this Hammerhead guy is sorta like me. And afterwards, he says, disappointment with society. Well, if I'd taken one wrong step, I could have ended up like him. Going back to Saitama's backstory as such in episode 1, he was unemployed, so miserable with job hunting that he was essentially about to let Crablante kill him, and then risked his life to fight it afterwards, setting him on this path to being a hero. But if Crablante wasn't there that day, what would Saitama have done? After going home with the same disappointment with society that Hammerhead feel? Well, down the line, if he'd heard about the Paradise movement, he probably would have joined this bald army. And I think Saitama's hero journey likely mirrors a lot of the authors. In the Road to Hero special, he gets told off for not being able to pay rent because he's too busy with his hero hobby instead of getting a job. And he's kind of just lounging around a lot of the day too. But much like the author, he got better and better at this silly hobby until he got to the point where he can do it full time. But like he says to Hammerhead, one wrong step and he could have ended up like him. If he didn't have this immense power, he could still be unemployed, drifting around aimlessly with absolutely no idea what to do with himself. Also, I think there's this assumption that if you make your hobby your job, you'll enjoy every single second of it, right? And never have any sort of issues. But whilst I'm not at the stage where, I can do this full time, I know that's not the case. Especially where, I have spoken to a few people who do YouTube full time, and I know it's not the perfect paradise that it might necessarily look from the outside. And imagine that's true of just about anything, right? Obviously now more than ever, we live in a world where you can make your living off of just about anything, if you get big enough on social media. And so I think this is important to bear in mind. How in the following episode, after being accepted into the Hero Association, Saitama doesn't feel great about it. The idea of climbing ranks, etc., something he needed to do to carry on doing this full time, just isn't for him. It's not like he's a monk who doesn't care about being popular or recognized, as we later see, but with regards to how he's feeling here, it's just that there's always something that kinda sucks, no matter what you do. I see it a lot less often than I used to, but this idea of finding your purpose still kind of floats around a bit. That one day you'll just find something and it'll click and it'll be perfect. I don't think that's realistic at all. I think no matter what it is, there will always be some part of it you don't like, right? And if you're expecting that not to be the case, you're probably going to end up very unsatisfied. Anyway, moving ahead to episode 7 with the meteor. Not a ton to say on the first half. I do love Bang's whole in a pinch just muddle through, the outcome won't change, so that's best. It's simple, but it's a really nice reminder to have. When everything's going wrong and you start panicking, just do what you can, Likewise, I've not got too much more to say on the meteor scene for this video, even though it's insanely cool. But the aftermath is brilliant. I really love this scene. Saitama smashed a meteor that the rank 7 and 17 heroes had no effect on. Even number 3 could only watch. His punch against the meteor saved countless lives. No one else could have done that. He didn't manage to do it perfectly. There's a lot of destruction, but regardless, he did an incredible job here to have no one die from this. He saved countless lives, stopped multiple cities from being flattened, and yet the world still blames him for it. When he steps out for a walk, he's greeted with anger from 2 heroes, claiming he's a fraud and inciting the crowd against him. And remember, Saitama doesn't have much left to aspire to. I'm going to come back to this, but being known and liked was one of the few things he seemed to be interested in besides getting a good fight. He wants appreciation for his hero work, to be recognized for all he does. And so even though they don't know it, the tank tops are taken away, one of the very few things Saitama had to look forward to. Obviously, the pair of them are complete cowards, trying to publicly bully someone weaker than them, as far as they know anyway, for their own gain and status. And it's no coincidence that all the rookie crushers we see in the series are either incredibly mid like these guys, or are deeply insecure about their own placement, like Snek or Fubuki. Sounds incredibly cliche, but it really is true that people only hate on others when they're not feeling great about themselves. I've done it, we've probably all done it, and again, this is probably all based on the author's experiences as a manga writer. And so, how does Saitama deal with it? Yep, you're right, so what? Blame me if you want. I did the right thing. He doesn't try to argue back because there was clearly no point with the state they were in, nor would it bring him any satisfaction either if he did convince them of that. And speaking of doing the right thing, episode 9 is probably the best episode of the whole series. The one where we all went from thinking this was a funny show to a fantastic one. It of course starts in episode 8 with the appearance of the Deep Sea King. And I think part of what keeps One Punch Man so engaging is that every single character brags so much about their strength, right? And they all have a good amount of evidence for them to do so. But a lot of the time, we have no idea who's going to win when 2 characters face off against each other. This sounds obvious, but some series do a much better job of this than others. I'm sure you can think of plenty of times where a fight started and you already know who was going to win before it began. But others do a really good job of keeping things uncertain. One Piece, for instance, with its bounty system is brilliant at this. It's not just a measure of raw strength alone, but also factors in how much of a threat they are to the world government. Meaning it's never as simple as, well, this person's number is higher, so they'd beat this guy. One Punch Man does something similar with its hero rankings, and especially when characters like Genos can lose over and over again while still surviving, it makes it genuinely pretty hard to tell which way a lot of the fights are gonna go, especially with Garou in Season 2. Also, the threat levels in One Punch Man are really vague, with things like Vaccine Man being on the same level as Elder Centipede, and apparently Boros is just a dragon level threat too. or armored gorilla being the same level as Deep Sea King, both demon level threats. And the point of that whole side jab is that whilst this was probably the last fight before it became pretty clear what the pattern was going to be, everyone else goes in, Saitama comes along afterwards and beats the villain, I personally found that really easy to forget. I found myself so drawn into whether Puri Puri Prisoner, hilarious character by the way, I don't care what you say, but whether he'd actually managed to beat this guy, or whether Sonic could, or whether Genos could. The author really uses Saitama so well, and knows exactly when not to use it, which is why after this we only really get the fight against Boros before we shift to a lot of the other characters like Garou and some of the other heroes. But anyway, Mumen Rider against the Deep Sea King is probably people's favourite moment in Season 1. And for very good reason. Completely outclassed and outmatched, yet throwing himself at it again and again. It's hard not to relate to him and to be inspired by him. When he says things like, I know I'm too weak even for Class B. I know more than anyone else that I'll never beat you, but I must fight you anyway. I'm the only one left. It's not about winning or losing. It's about me taking you on right here, right now. People really like Mumen Rider. They've always rooted for more from him, and it's pretty clear why from this scene, selfless beyond reason, continuing to fight on in spite of hitting what he thinks is his limit, much like Saitama said earlier, who's gonna fight if all the heroes run away? Now, there's probably an argument to be made that he's actually really limiting himself with his mindset of, I'm not good enough for Class B. We see throughout One Punch Man that people just become whatever they're obsessed with. Crablante ended up that way because he ate too much crab. Someone like Sonic continues to get faster because he remains obsessed with doing so. And likewise, of course, for Garou becoming more stronger and more monstrous. And so his constant thinking of, I'm just Class C, is possibly holding him back. But regardless, in spite of it all, he continues to fight. The story is brutally cruel to him. His incredible moment where he hypes himself up for one giant punch results in absolutely nothing, where usually you'd expect some great power up, where the tables are finally turned and the underdog finds a way to win, but that doesn't happen. Now, there are so many parallels between him and Saitama that they both fight for what they think is right. They both have this extremely pure heroism, not caring in the slightest about ranks or titles, and yet despite being the same age at 25, and Saitama probably training less than Mumen Rider has. He said he started at 22. Mumen Rider's probably been training longer than that, but the difference in their power couldn't be any wider. And so no one would blame Mumen Rider if he stopped being a hero after getting so many repeated injuries. Or at the very least, if he stopped going along to threat levels way too high for him. It would be completely understandable if he got demoralized or felt defeated by being limited to dealing with much smaller, less important, less flashy cases after facing nothing but loss after loss. And likewise for Saitama, after having so many consecutive wins and losing all interest in it, he could have stopped any time he wanted. No one can force him to be a hero or to do anything really. And yet what he does next is, without a doubt, my favourite scene in the whole series. After punching down the Sea King, for the first time ever he has a crowd cheering him on. It was only an episode or two where they were all jeering at him, he was getting death threats in the mail. And remember, him being popular and known is basically the only thing we've ever seen kind of invigorate and interest him besides having a stronger fight. You could honestly say it's like the only thing left in this world for him. But as soon as the crowd turns on him, and this incredibly irritating guy starts bad-mouthing the other heroes, claiming that they were weaklings and that they didn't do anything heroic, which very easy to say from the sidelines when you're not the one doing anything, but the usually oblivious, goofy Saitama proves himself surprisingly shrewd and noble, as he gives up his last source of light in the world, setting himself up to be the fraud that people think he is. The other heroes weaken the monster, so it was easy to beat. Good thing I was late, I hardly did anything, but I beat it alone. Those few seconds Mumen Rider bought did actually matter in the end. They gave Saitama enough time to arrive and save Genos' life, and so by extension, several more from everything Genos does in the future. If he hadn't thrown himself at the Sea King, it would have killed Genos. Yet, in spite of so heroically throwing himself at a fight that he couldn't win, that sacrifice wouldn't have gone acknowledged without Saitama, who ensured that the world would appreciate that at the cost of himself. And unlike a lot of other shonen you might watch where the character puts their life on the line to confront some great threat, this is something that we could all face ourselves. Ironically, by having infinite power, it actually makes him more relatable to us. Because most of us, and I mentioned this earlier, but obviously I'm aware of these videos, I'm speaking to the entire world, right? And I'm very lucky to live somewhere where, there's no concerns about war, etc. But most of us are not ever going to have to face a choice like this, right? Of whether we risk our life or not. But we will absolutely be in situations where we have to weigh up our own desires, our own pride and standing against what's right. And for both Moomin, Rider, and Saitama, it's far more important for them to be able to look themselves in the mirror the following day, even if it means giving up something that they really wanted. Apparently there used to be a big debate over whether Saitama was actually heroic or not, because there's a case to be made that he never actually risks his life, right? And so you could argue that in turn means he can't be heroic because of that. But this scene alone proved to me that he is as great of a hero as anyone could aspire to be. Episode 9 is just such an incredible episode, and I don't know if this is going to be controversial, but I honestly think without it, One Punch Man would have never reached the levels of fame that it has. Now, I don't have much to say on episode 10 for this video. It was super cool seeing all the Class S heroes, especially seeing them fight, and again, the writer definitely knew what he was doing, starting the episode off with the rank 2 psychic power user, because obviously immediately the question of would that work against Saitama enters our minds, which I know is answered at some point way later on, but I won't go into that here. Likewise, I think the prophecy was a really cool idea as well, because we still have no idea if that was referring to Boros, Garou, or anything else that happens later on. For all we know, that prophecy is still looming in the background, and the series as a whole I think is really good at leaving these little side plots for us to theorize about, Blast, Am I Master Strength, the whole deal between Drive Knight, Metal Knight, and Genos, etc. And speaking of intrigue, when we see Melzagard tanking 4 S-class heroes, 2 of which are incredibly high ranked, Silverfang and Atomic Samurai, and then the penultimate episode ends with someone above him finally surviving a hit from Saitama, I'm sure I wasn't the only one who was pretty shook the first time they watched this. But watching it back, it also shows that very shrewd, kind side of Saitama. Much like he spared Hammerhead because he thought he's just like me for real, after hearing that Boros also wanted a worthy, challenging fight to cure his boredom, in a similar fashion to what he did with Hammerhead, he hits him in a way that only shatters his armor without killing him, beginning one of the coolest fights I've ever seen. It's still one of my favorites, Besides Boros briefly announcing his attacks, it doesn't waste time on long explanations that are sometimes kind of annoying. In a fight like this, we just feel the power of their attacks through the amazing animation instead. And something you might have noticed with Vaccine Man, the Sea King, is Saitama hates it whenever anyone starts rambling about their important reason for fighting. He always interrupts them, but he tries to stomach listening to Boros excitedly talk about his reason for a bit, before the pain of seeing someone escape, the exact frustration he's felt this whole time, just gets too much for him. Are you done yet with this fight? And with Boros' response, an honest no, he continues to play along, letting Boros enjoy the fight he'd been seeking, as he launches Saitama all the way to the damn moon. And the anime didn't make this super clear, but if you've been wondering why he throws this rock up and down, he's trying to gauge how the moon's gravity compares to Earth so he can get the right amount of force in his jump to not destroy the planet when he lands. I'm telling you, when it comes to quick thinking on the spot, the guy's a genius, right? He doesn't act it, but he is very, very smart. And of course also the fact that, pretty much his second thought after landing on the moon was, how do I not hurt anyone when I land? which just speaks volumes about him as a person. But he can't keep playing this game much longer, and immediately after landing throws a much stronger punch, followed by a barrage of null punches. Boros used his last resort, causing him to have the same fiery heartbeat we saw from Saitama in episode 1, as the first serious punch of the series draws things to a close with a spectacular shot of the earth and the clouds separated by his punch. Boros calls out Saitama's lie as the camera pans up towards the moon, as distant and isolated as Saitama, before he walks away in silence. Even the alleged dominator of the universe couldn't free him from his boredom. Saitama would have to keep looking. One Punch Man is a surprisingly moving mediation on fulfillment. Saitama's struggle of what he exchanged for power and his original goal is far more relatable and well thought out than it first seems. And Season 2 has a bunch of equally interesting questions. I'll be dropping my video on that in a couple of days, so be sure to subscribe to not miss that. Lastly, a thank you to this video's sponsor, Figgies. If the plaques behind me caught your eye and you want some affordable but quality anime merch, which you can put just about anywhere, then check out the link below. I've got their third wave of Yu-Gi-Oh here, so we've got Jinzo and Joey, as well as the others you can see behind me. It's all super quality stuff. It's very small, so you can put it anywhere you want. It's even magnetic, so it can go on your fridge if you really don't have any space. It's all very well made. I think you'll be just as pleased as I was when I got them. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in a few days for the Season 2 video.